Hello and welcome everyone to this latest episode of the Tghat Forum discussion. I have Teklehaymanot Weldemichel for a guest today. He is a research fellow at the Department of Geography at Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And he has recently written a paper titled, an opinion article titled Inventing Hell: How the Ethiopian and Eritrean regimes produced famine in Tigray. So we'll talk about some of the topics, some of the big points that he makes in the paper, the arguments he makes in the paper. But before we go into the discussion, I would like to say welcome to Teklehaymanot and thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Teklay. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate you taking the time to join me for this discussion. So Teklehaymanot, you write in the paper that that in the last time the projection for famine and for security was done, which I think was in October 2020. So this is right before the war started. That Tigray was one of the least food insecure regions in Ethiopia. And by contrast, according to the World Food Programme projections for June to September, so this is June to September of 2021, about 6.3 million Tigrayans are in need of emergency assistance, and food stocks have been looted and systematically destroyed, farming prevented, and trade of basic commodities curtailed. By the beginning of June this year, 350,000 Tigrayans were already facing catastrophic levels of food shortages and were on integrated food security phase classification, or according to this measurement, about 350 Tigrayans were on catastrophic level. So this is the last category according to the IPC. And you went on to argue that this is because of man-made famine. But before we go into the details, I thought we would start with you giving us a definition of what man-made famine is, and kind of making a distinction between man-made famine and other natural famine.
Thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for going through the details of the story in the article. And as you rightly say, I write in the article that this is totally a man-made famine. And when I say it's a man-made famine, it's to say that the famine was intentionally created by political actors like the state and allied actors. It is man-made because it's imposed by human actors in the process, and that is different from a famine that naturally occurs for example, from natural disasters. Of course, in analysis of famine, we often don't see famine as purely induced by natural disasters. It's often related to political instability. It's often related to already problematic social and political circumstances that put people into vulnerable positions. And we have famine, which is usually induced by disasters, by calamities, but also those kind of famines are also often accompanied by political instability, political decision making by powerful actors. So in this case, in the case of Tigray, we have an almost fully politically induced famine, like state-induced famine, state-imposed famine. So that's what the kind of distinction that I wanted to make. So the natural calamities, natural disaster has little or no, there is no like natural cause to the famine that we now see in Tigray. That's the point I want to make.
Yes. So one of the arguments you make in the paper, Teklehaymanot, is that famine has been used as a weapon of war and as a tool of genocide. How is famine used to achieve this purpose? How is famine used in general terms as a weapon of war and as a tool of genocide? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So I mean, like generally, historically, we have examples of warring parties using famine as a as a weapon of subjugation, as a weapon of making the other party, the opposing parties surrender. And we have seen state-imposed famines used to subjugate populations that resist state power. And we have seen famine used as a genocidal tool. For example, we have seen it during the Holocaust. We have seen it in the German war against in Namibia. We have seen it in Biafra in southwestern Nigeria, where the Nigerian state used famine to force the Igbo population to surrender. And we have all those evidences, historical evidences, that show that states and powerful actors, military actors, use hunger as a tool of forcing people to surrender. And that's also what we see in the crisis in Tigray. The Ethiopian state and its allies, including the Eritrean regime, have I have from reading all the reports by like the media and reports by different actors, I have a sense that many people understand the crisis that we see as purely humanitarian crisis, and they don't. People don't often see the underlying cause of the famine. And the purpose of this paper is also to point out that this is not a residual effect of the war. It is part of the design of the war. And when I say that, I will come to that later, but when I say that, we have a lot of evidences showing that the Ethiopian state have systematically used different mechanisms to create famine conditions in order to force the population into subjugation, but also not just to force people into subjugation, but also what looks like a systematic extermination of people to eliminate as large population as possible. And famine is very effective tool to do that.
Indeed.
Without blooding your hands, of course.
Of course, yeah. And you say that one of the mechanisms that they use to induce famine in Tigray is by through systematic looting and destruction of Tigray's economy. Can you? I wonder if you could talk about how they use those techniques, that systematic looting and the destruction of Tigray, to create the conditions that we are witnessing now in Tigray. I think one of the things that we have been hearing over the past couple of, I think 6 months now, is that about 400,000 Tigrayans have been living in famine-like conditions. Although that's, I find that a bit absurd, because if they have been in famine-like conditions in June, surely because the situation has been worsening, then there should be another description rather than famine-like conditions. There is no way that they would remain in that same state, even though the situation is changing. But anyway, we could take that term. That's fine for now. Can you talk about how they use the systematic destruction and looting and the other malign activities that they use to engineer the situation that we believe exists in Tigray now? Yeah.
So I mean, you're right when they say like 400,000 Tigrayans have been in famine conditions since June. That was like beginning of June when they declared that, and a lot has happened since then. For example, by the time they declared that there were 400,000 in famine conditions, there was access to Tigray. There was possibilities to bring in aid. There was possibilities to do some limited commercial activities. So people still had access to a little bit of aid and some market access to market items. So things have changed since then. We have now a full blockade of the region where nothing is going in and out, and the situation has deteriorated. And I believe like many folds of that size of population is now in famine conditions. And about the systematic destruction and looting of the Tigray's economy, we when I say systematic, it is because it involves destroying and systematically looting of everything, including small-scale farms, food stocks in households, ranging all the way to factories and factory complexes and businesses and hospitals, whatnot, everything that was in Tigray. And this is systematic. You have troops going in, and you have sections of the troops loading, coming in with trucks and loading all kind of items from households and from businesses, from agricultural investments, and transporting it across the border to Eritrea and to Amhara region. And we have also seen troops going house to house, torching villages down. We have seen troops going and looting factories which employed low-skilled, small, low-paid employees, like the textile factories. We have seen all kind of destructions in the region, and we have also, if someone goes to for example, Western Tigray, where Google Earth Pro has updated the satellite image, you see ethnic Amhara militia that occupy Western Tigray have gone from village to village, destroying every house, every village, and showing the scale of destruction. So, and of course, like I said, everything, including livestock and stockpiles of crop, have been transported across the border. This is what I meant when I say systematic destruction, and the scale is like it's beyond anyone can imagine. And according to the Bureau of Agriculture and Rural Development of the interim administration, the puppet administration during the occupation, they said up to 90% of Tigray's agricultural production has been destroyed, damaged. So that you could see the scale of the scale of damage that has caused on the production system of the region. That is what I meant by systematic looting and destruction.
Yeah. So I think that the key word here is the word systematic. So you are saying that the destruction and the looting that has been inflicted on Tigray is both deliberate and that it was systematic.
Yes.
And I think at least the government, or the regime rather, would argue that true, some damage has been inflicted on Tigray, but to the extent that damage was inflicted on Tigray, it was a collateral damage. It was a damage that couldn't have been avoided, and that it wasn't systematic. That is what they would argue. And here in the paper, you present piece of evidence to establish the contrary fact, to establish the fact that everything that has been done in Tigray, the destruction has been systematic. Can you kind of take us through the evidence that you present to argue that it has indeed been systematic?
Yes, I mean, like, and that's also partly the reason why I wrote this paper. It's to show that this isn't simple, like I said, residual effect of a war. So we have, in war context, we have crossfire affecting, like that, causing collateral damage, killing civilians unintentionally. Yeah. So although it's very difficult to define what's intentional and what's not. But in this case, we see systematic and intentional destruction of properties. So when you have soldiers going from village to village and destroying, for example, we have, that was in March, a village in a small district called Ejected in south of Mekelle, where you have over 500 homes. And this is not like homes in very close to each other. They are like stretched over a wide village, like a rural landscape, and over 500 homes destroyed within 24 hours. And then you have soldiers going to fruit gardens and cutting trees down. You have soldiers taking away every machinery in factories and setting the factories ablaze. You have all kind of destruction that looks very intentional. And I can, for example, tell you the case of my parents' home. We lived in a small village outside town, and we had a small farm with a garden next to it, and we have all kind of crops that we grow around it. We had livestock, and what happened is when the Eritrean troops came, they came with their trucks. They parked their truck outside our door. They knocked the doors down, but they took everything that was in the house, including our memories, like pictures and everything that was in the house. And they occupied the house for long, and they took away all the food that my parents had in the house. And that's not just isolated case; it's all over the region. And this goes the same for businesses, like for big businesses, like mechanized farming fields, industries. Like to take an example, for example, the Almeda textile factory in Adwa, where Eritrean soldiers took away all the machines and they set the factory ablaze at the end. The same with the factory next to it, the Sawa marbles. So when I say it's systematic, it's not caught in crossfire. It is intentionally done by soldiers going around and doing all the damage.
So do you is it your contention that Eritreans weren't acting independently, that there was some level of coordination and orchestration with Ethiopians, that there was a purpose that they were trying to achieve by destroying Tigray, and whatever Eritreans have done in Tigray, and we know what they have done, they have totally destroyed Tigray, was being done with the full support and knowledge of the Ethiopian regime, because there was a purpose that they were trying to achieve? That would be your contention, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, like I said Eritrean soldiers because I have an example, like a real life example that is related to me personally. But you have allied militias from Amhara region doing the same across Western Tigray, across Southern Tigray. And you go, for example, to Mokhoni, to Southern Tigray, where Amhara militia have destroyed like mechanized farms, investments by private investors in around the town of Mokhoni. And you have the same process going on. For example, Alex Dual actually writes a report on the orchard farms, like in Southern Tigray, around Samre, where Amhara militia went around and cutting down fruit trees and all that. So this is not limited to Eritreans. It is systemic. It's across all the forces that were involved in on the war against Tigray.
Yeah. So, and I think the other point that you mentioned in the paper to argue that everything had been planned before November 4, 2020. And one of the points you raised is that the Ethiopian Central Bank had instituted the change of notes. And that was an attempt to kind of divorce Tigray from the financial system so that it would be easy to deprive Tigrayans of access to their banking services. Could you talk about how, because then we all had suspicions, of course, as to why the government of Ethiopia might be doing that, but at least now, with the benefit of hindsight, I think we have a clearer picture of why that was needed to be done. Yeah. And you mentioned that in the paper. That is another piece of evidence you present to demonstrate that everything is systematic and that everything had been planned. It wasn't something that was improvised later when the war started. Can you talk about how the financial service was also used against Tigray?
Yeah, so I mean, like we have to see the war in its broader context, in like the context of the last 3 years. So we've had confrontations, we have had political differences developing, and the National Bank of Ethiopia issued a decree that they were changing banknotes on the 14th of September last year, and that was just barely
so 1.5 months. To make it clear to our listeners, that would be
1.5 months before the 1.5 months before the war started. So, and on the 14th of September, they issued that they issued a statement that they are changing the banknotes and that people should prepare to change their banknotes. And then they actually did. Like in a few days, they started like distributing cash to commercial banks across the country, but of course with a lot of restriction on Tigray. So very few commercial bank branches in Tigray got their new currency and they were able to exchange, but not all banks across Tigray had the new currency to exchange it for the old ones. And I don't know if you remember, but there were lots of news going on around, like about traveling from Addis to Tigray, like flying from Addis to Tigray, where people were getting detained at the airport when they carried more than 2,000 birr in their pockets, 2,000 birr of the new notes, and that was, I mean, for a careful observer, we could see that there was something going on. There was something going on to prevent Tigray from getting access to the new currency, and that went on. And then we see, and this is a short period between the announcement that there will be new currency and the start of the war. So many Tigrayans, because there were no because not many of the branches had access to the new currency, many Tigrayans hadn't changed their money, and even the ones who were able to change their cash, they couldn't withdraw most of the money. There was a lot of restriction put in place to prevent people from getting as much cash as they want, because and before that there was no some limit like that. So you could see that this was a preparation for something. And by the time the war started, many people hadn't changed their currencies, and I have heard lots of stories that people have lost a lot of the cash that they had. And this is the cash economy we're talking about. We're not like a digital banking. We don't have digital system to use. So whatever money they have, people had it at hand. Like especially farmers, especially small scale businesses who use cash on daily basis. So they have lost lots of their cash, and also, like, along with that, you see when the war started, like, you have invading troops coming in, taking whatever cash was in the banks and changing it at a very cheap rate, like a really low rate for people who haven't changed their cash. And you have lots of ways of extorting money from Tigrayans that is linked to the financial measurements. But in addition to the changing of the currency notes, we also see so that the federal government imposed the national bank imposed like a decree that the Tigrayans across the country could not withdraw money, could not deposit money, or so there was a suspension of accounts that were either open to bank branches in Tigray, including citizens from other regions, but also Tigrayans elsewhere in the country. They were restricted from withdrawing cash, and that went on for a couple of months into the war. And we saw there were like limited access to banks when the federal government captured Mekelle. We had access to bank in Mekelle and few of the big cities, in few branches of banks, and people had very limited possibilities of withdrawing or depositing money. Of course, people wouldn't deposit money in that situation. And we also saw people traveling across the region to get access to bank in Mekelle, for example. Like my neighbors from central Tigray traveled all the way to Mekelle, either walked through the mountains or they took very expensive taxi, like a bus ride. We're taking a lot of risk. So one of the examples that I mentioned in the paper is a case where the Medicine Sans Frontières, so the medical Doctors Without Borders, witnessed the killing of I think it was like, they said 4 at the moment at that time, but it was 21 people who were murdered by the Ethiopian army on their way from Mekelle to Adwa. And one of the people who was killed was a neighbor, our neighbor, and he was a young boy who came to Mekelle to get money, to withdraw money and to go back home to his parents. And like, he was killed, and you could see the amount of risk, the level of risk people took to access banks, and that was intentionally done so, because the troops were extorting money from people in that way. So that's what I say. And then of course now we have a situation since the 28th of June. We have a situation where there is no access to bank at all, and bank accounts are suspended, and there is no bank services within the region. That's what I meant when I say there are like layers and layers of mechanisms, financial mechanisms to drain cash from the region.
Yeah, if we can dwell on a little bit on the last point that you mentioned with regard to what happened on the 28th of June, following the defeat of the federal army from Tigray. The regime told the international community that it was declaring a unilateral ceasefire. But in the paper, you argue that that was actually a lie, and it was starvation by another name. And what happened is that when the regime was in control of Tigray, or at least partially, it was trying to play all cards. It was letting aid to trickle in so that the international community would be happy. But it was also destroying Tigray so that Tigray would be subjugated. So it was playing all cards. But after it was militarily defeated, it focused on only one form of weapon, and that is using starvation by blockading Tigray. Can you talk more about what exactly happened and how the government sold the starvation as a ceasefire and why it has succeeded in that?
Yeah, so that's also a very interesting twist of events. Really for any normal person that observes what was going on, for someone who speaks Tigrinya or Amharic, or someone who follows the Ethiopian discourse, it was clearly not ceasefire. I say so because I have been following the story that was going on in Tigray at the time. For example, we had a massive battlefield operation that was going on the couple of weeks before the 28th of June, which the government doesn't admit, but we have evidences that its troops were defeated and many of them were captured. I think like 9,000 soldiers were captured, and the number of casualties at date is a lot, regardless of how hype the reports are. So we have had a situation where the federal troops were defeated and its allies were defeated, and they had to withdraw. And on the 28th of June, the federal troops, the last units of the army withdrew from Mekelle. And on their way from Mekelle, they disabled all kind of communication system in the city. They disabled all kind of communication and banking system in the city. And they tried to, in some cases, they tried to drain the cash from the banks. They wanted to empty the banks, and they wanted to take the cash. In some banks, they were not successful because the bank managers resisted. But in many cases, they did take the cash. And on their way out of Mekelle, they were shooting at people. They went across the town looting all kind of things like cars, for example, to drive them to Addis. So this wasn't an army that was doing a ceasefire. It was an army that was defeated, and they were doing the last minute damage on the region. And for example, the disabled, and we have seen, like, for example, the leaders of the army going to the UNICEF office, for example, and disabling their communication system, and they have done that across the region. And so when they declared this was this ceasefire for a Tigrayan, it was clearly not a ceasefire. And I think for other Ethiopians as well, it wasn't a ceasefire, because the next day or the day after, the prime minister came out and saying that this wasn't the intention wasn't to let Tigray be at peace. It was to show that that it can't survive by itself, that it still has to depend on Ethiopia. And he also said that he had made sure that Tigray cannot survive by itself, that he has turned Mekelle into Bashasha, into the village where he comes from, that Mekelle and Tigray were not politically significant enough to invest on. So that's, for someone who follows the Ethiopian discourse, you could clearly see that this wasn't ceasefire. But well, of course, the international community was really eager to see an end to the war, and they thought this was actually something that they can follow. But it didn't take long for example, for the EU people to realize that this wasn't ceasefire. The EU actually in early July said that this was a de facto blockade, de facto siege to serve people, to create a famine condition. And similarly, other, for example, the United States Agency for International Development also said that this was a blockade, de facto blockade, and blockade it was. So in early July, we saw the government preventing aid from coming into Tigray, while the aid movement within the region improved significantly since the takeover of the recapture of Mekelle by the Tigrayan forces. We saw the region getting more isolated, and then we saw retreating troops and allied militia destroying bridges that connected Tigray to the rest of the country, that connected Tigray to supply routes to where aid comes from. So it became clear that this wasn't a ceasefire. And of course, they started staging battle on the front lines. They started fighting the Tigrayan forces everywhere, and they still were occupying. They still are occupying Western Tigray, and they were still occupying Southern Tigray when they were saying they were on ceasefire. So you could see that it wasn't ceasefire, and of course from a local resident point of view, the ceasefire, which the federal government claimed was to enable farmers to farm their land, was to enable free movement of aid. But farming season was already halfway, like the rain season was already halfway, and it was very late for many parts of Tigray. Large part of Tigray, the planting season had already passed. And if the intention of the state of the regime was to enable farmers to plant, they would have withdrawn from large parts of Tigray, and it wasn't necessary to withdraw to allow farmers to farm. And we have seen that the troops were actually preventing people from farming. They were going from farm to farm, destroying equipments before that. So it doesn't really make sense. Everything that they have done, both before and after the declaration of the ceasefire, doesn't show that it was a ceasefire. It was actually a form of structural violence. It was a violence of a different form, more of like a covert kind of violence. Yeah, but of course, some actors bought it, and they still, like you see that in the UN reports. You see that in other reports saying that the government had declared the ceasefire, which is bullshit from my point of view.
Yeah. I think we'll come back to that, Teklehaymanot. So at least as far as you are concerned, the Ethiopian and the Eritrean regimes have visited hell on Tigray in the form of starvation and famine. And you are absolutely convinced that that is the case. And indeed, you present multiple pieces of evidence in the paper. And I think anybody who has read the paper would arrive at the same conclusion, that starvation is being used as a weapon. I don't think there is any way getting around that problem. But one of the things you just mentioned in that the international community seems to be reluctant to say that that is the case. And indeed, some Western leaders have been bending backwards to believe that the story that is being sold by Abiy, that on the 28th of June, what happened was out of its volition, out of generosity, it withdrew from Tigray, and that it has been trying its best to facilitate aid into Tigray. And to the extent that aid wasn't being delivered to Tigray, it was because the TPLF has been obstructing aid. So these are the arguments that the regime has been telling to the Western powers, and at least some of them have both them, and you accuse them of failing to understand the situation and of letting down the Tigray people. Why? I mean, you gave me one reason. One reason is that there is a political interest to believe Abiy, because they have an incentive to support him. But beyond that, I think it takes some sort of ignorance to believe the story or the narrative that the regime is selling. But can you take us through the reasons why the international community has failed and fallen for the tricks of the regime?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so when I talk about the failure of the international community, it also goes back to before the war. So we have had alarm bells regarding what was going to unfold. Like, for example, many people could see that something was going to I mean, for example, military confrontation was going to unfold in the region. For example, the regional government of Tigray issued several letters to both international, like regional and international multilateral organizations just before the war, like few months within the few months before the war. And we also saw the EU issuing statements of concerns just before the war. That there was something going to brewing around the borders of the region. And I think there was the international community failed to respond to that, and the war would have been prevented if there was like active involvement of the AU or the other regional actors, or the UN for that matter. And that's one of the failures. And we also saw when the war started, there was significant evidence showing that there was horrible atrocities taking place. There were horrific distractions, and like distractions beyond what is normally expected in war situation. Distractions beyond collateral damage taking place, and there were lots of reports coming up, and it was enough to come to sort of conclusion that this was a devastating war when the government imposed media blackout, imposed restrictions on every kind of movement into Tigray. So it was enough alarm for the international community to respond, to react to this. But people failed to see that. And we have seen, and we have seen, for example, aid being prevented for months, and like international actors not saying anything about it, or brushing it away in order to appease the regime, in order to claiming in order to get access to the country, in order to access the region. They were brushing away all kind of concerns, all kind of bureaucratic pressures that the federal government was putting in place. And we've also seen like people pretending like nothing was going on. For example, the UN office in Addis Ababa, like the country office in Addis, has clearly sided with the regime. We have seen UN officials clearly making the same kind of arguments as the federal government, presenting Tigrayans as traitors, presenting Tigrayan political leadership as terrorists, and who should be subjected to law enforcement measures. And that is a clear failure of the international community in that regard. But one of the challenges that we had in the beginning of the war was to convince, like it was very difficult to convince the international community that something as horrific was taking place. First of all, because Abiy has a license to do whatever, because he's a peace Nobel laureate, and he's a peacemaker. He has made that image that he's a promising reformist guy, and it was very difficult for many people to buy the stories that we were telling, the stories that our parents were being killed and chased from place to place to survive the killings. It was very difficult to convince them, because that was already an established image of them. So these are the kind of things that prevented the international community from reacting to the crisis, from responding to the crisis appropriately.
Yeah. So I think you are absolutely spot on as to why the international community has failed for him. Number one, I think there was an incentive to believe, given that they had awarded him the Nobel Peace Prize, given that they were totally wedded to the story that this was a peacemaker and everything, then it would have been an extraordinary amount of kind of turn of events if they turned around and said that this was actually a tyrant who was starving his people to death. So it wouldn't have been easy for them to believe. So they have an incentive to deny what he's doing and still cling on to the original belief that they both. But I think that is a separate topic for maybe for another time. So up until now, we have been talking at an abstract level what starvation is.
But in that case, I also want to talk about like how I'm like now trying to write something else and trying to show how the international mechanisms, like the UN, for example, doesn't respond to citizens to the challenge that citizens face within tyrant countries, regimes. It's those institutions are formed to respond to nations' interests. They are formed to respond to governments instead of to citizens, and that's clearly the Tigray situation is the clearest example, one of the clearest examples you can find in that regard.
Yeah. But I think we will kind of veer away from the points that you make in the paper. And I think the one thing that I would want to say here is that you conclusively argue that starvation is being used as a weapon. And the argument that you provide here are indubitable. I don't think there is anybody who could doubt that starvation is being used as a weapon. It's just blatant for everybody to see. But the discussion so far, Teklehaymanot, has been at an abstract level, and I would want us to talk a little bit about how the blood and soul people actually living in Tigray are coping with this. How are they managing the elderly, the women, the lactating women, especially? There was a story about lactating women and how they were struggling to feed, to breastfeed their children. How do you think people are enduring this in Tigray?
Yeah, so I can't talk about the science of hunger. Like I can't say what it does to the body of humans, and that's up to scientists to say that. But for a normal person, hunger is hunger. It's a painful process to go through, and you have. By the time when there was possible to gain report, it was in June, and there was 2.2 million people that were internally displaced, living in, but I can't even call them camps. They are in schools, on the sides of streets, and everywhere in cities that have no infrastructure to deal with that kind of population. So you have, and these are people who were pushed from, for example, Western Tigray, where many of the men were killed or put in concentration camps, and where the women and children were dumped on the banks of the Tigray River and forced to cross the river into the central parts of Tigray, into like Shire, Aksum, Adwa, and Mekelle, Adigrat, and all other places. So you have women and children living in horrible conditions in camps, and they don't have access to humanitarian aid. They don't have access to basic items, food items, and they don't have access to places to stay in. So you can imagine the scale of the effect on these people. You have children dying as they sleep in schools. They have children and women dying together in wherever they are staying in camps. So, and then you have elderly parents who normally would be taken cared for by their children, and whose children are either killed in the war or they have joined the struggle and now starving to death. You have elderly people whose homes, including my parents, for example, whose homes have been systematically destroyed and looted and starving to death wherever they are. And that's the kind of situation I'm talking about. And you have, like you said, mothers and pregnant women who don't have access to like the most basic thing, like small loaf of bread. You have people who don't have access to the basic services like water. So that's the kind of situation we're talking about in Tigray.
Yeah. What about in terms of long-term impacts, Teklehaymanot? So I think I shudder to think, but it is unavoidable that there are people who are emaciated children. There are people who are really thin, for want of a better word. What do you think is that the impact of this in the long term, in terms of the infrastructure of Tigray, in terms of the people, and especially my focus would be on the people, on the children, on the emaciated children, on the children who are going to bed, if there is a bed, without food, without having had food for days. how do you think would it be devastating for Tigray going forward in terms of long term?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely devastating, and that's what I mean. Like that's what keeps me up all night. I mean, like every day when you see images of small children, children that haven't even tasted food before, just born into famine condition, and sucking on milkless mothers, like hungry mothers, and these kids are going to grow. If they survive, they're going to grow, and they and like food, like nutrition scientists tell us that people who have suffered malnutrition from malnutrition at an early age have faced a lot of challenge when they grow up, if they grow up, and these are not like few people we're talking about. It's millions of children. It's a young population. Tigray is like it has a young population, and we are talking about half of the population going through this kind of malnutrition and food crisis, and we're talking about the future of citizens that are who are coming out of malnutrition and the crisis, and that's going to affect Tigray's future population and future productive population, and I don't think the mothers who are pregnant at the moment and who are going through so much traumatic experience on top of the hunger are going to, I don't think all of them will give birth to healthy babies, and that's also one thing that worries me a lot. You have, for example, we've been following the stories that there were like bombings of cities like Mekelle, for example, and I can't help but think about the hungry people in the schools, in the wherever they are staying, and the pregnant mothers sleeping on really terrible conditions in classrooms and whatnot, and going through that, and on top of that getting bombed and going through the traumatic experience that they are going through, and these people are going to give birth, and we don't know how the life of these babies is going to be, how their future is going to be. So this is going to have a significant effect on the future. But when you also think about the famine, we also need to think about what it is doing to Tigray's future economy, like in terms of like farming, for example. So when I said there has been systematic looting and destruction, we have seen livestock that people use to till their land, like oxen and horses and all, have been killed or transported across the border to Eritrea, or slaughtered and eaten by soldiers. We have seen agricultural equipment being systematically destroyed, and we have seen seed reserves being depleted, like farmers' storage and reserves being depleted, and of course, when you face hunger, when you face the famine condition, if you're a farmer, you will go for your reserves. You will go for the seed reserves you have, and for the whatever livestock that's left in the village. So we're talking about very like a deep, like overwhelming crisis where farmers would have to get some kind of intervention to get out of. Yeah.
Indeed, it's very horrific conditions that is unfolding in Tigray. I think we are almost done. I have one more question that I would just put it to you to reflect on. I don't think this is an easy question for anybody, but I think there is a consensus that the people who have visited carnage on Tigray must be made to pay for that, right? Mm-hmm. And since we're talking about starvation, there are some arguments to be made about restitution or compensation or reparation for the damage that the starvation would have caused. You were mentioning, for instance, what the long-term impact will be of a hungry child today, and I think that some kind of damage are easy to calculate. For instance, you could calculate the amount of damage that is caused by burning a factory, for instance. You could calculate the amount of damage that is caused by slaughtering an ox, for instance. You could calculate the amount of damage that is caused by burning a bridge. But how do you calculate the suffering and the damage caused by starving people And does Tigray have the right to ask for compensation or reparation or restitution or whatever word you use? I just want you to reflect on this. You could say kind of philosophical question as well, but also very, very important one.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question to ask, and I think the whole point of the writing and framing the crisis like this, like the way I do in the article, is also to show that this wasn't by accident. The famine wasn't by accident. It was intentionally done. So when we talk about intention, we're talking about crimes. We're talking about so as we see it now, from a perspective of Tigrayan, the crisis in Tigray, what happened in Tigray is a genocide. I mean, from my perspective, and I hope that independent bodies would confirm that, and we would like all the evidences would point to that direction, and it does point. And Alex Duval makes a good point on like how starvation can also be seen as a crime, as a war crime. And if you define something as a war crime, if you define something as something that has been intentionally put in place to cause suffering, to cause deprivation, you can also argue for compensation. You can also argue for all kind of reparations from the perpetrators of the crime. And for example, so Alex Duval points to three elements that constitute famine or like starvation as a crime. So is there like intentional deprivation, like deprivation of food and associated? Is there deprivation of food that was put in place? It was deprivation of food and associated items that was put in place by the actor, by the perpetrator, or the act of it can also have the act of it doesn't necessarily have to, like on the first element, it doesn't necessarily have to involve the mass days of population. You just have to prove that there has been a deprivation, that has been intentional measure by certain actor to prevent people from accessing food. That could lead to mass days or not. It doesn't matter. But the act itself is a second element. The act itself can be a crime in itself, like preventing people from accessing food in itself is like a crime. And then the third part is if there is an intention involved in it. If, for example, like for example, the systematic destruction of things that people depend on, the items that people depend on, can also constitute the starvation as a crime. So we probably have to look into this kind of analysis in order to come up with ways of finding a way for Tigray to secure reparations that it deserves, compensations that it deserves for that people deserve. For example, if you bring it to a level of farmers in Tigray need to be compensated for what they have lost. You can't, of course, bring people from the dead, but you can compensate the people that have lost a lot of things, and that they deserve that. So yeah, and that is of course from the perpetrators of the crime, but we don't know how this will end in the end. Yeah.
Yeah,
but yeah, also a good point to make there is like what we saw today. For example, the U.S. State Department, they are waiting for Abiy to accept peace in order to decide whether genocide have taken place in Tigray or not. This is absolutely disheartening and very hurtful to think about.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all we have time for today, Teklehaymanot, and I thank you and appreciate you for joining me today, taking the time to discuss the paper. And hopefully when you have written the second follow-up paper, I think that's the impression that I got. Hopefully you will give me the time to discuss that as well. But I would like to thank you more for writing the paper. This is a well-argued, sourced and well-written paper. It's very succinctly written. And I would strongly recommend that anybody who has any doubt about what is being done in Tigray in terms of famine and starvation, have a look in this paper. It's a short read, and it's absolutely convincing and absolutely important paper. And I think those of us, especially those of us who have been closely following the developments in Tigray, we have been convinced from the get-go that starvation was being used in Tigray, but we haven't made the case in this manner. And that's why I want to say thank you. This is very, very important document. And thank you for that, Teklehaymanot, and thank you, our listeners, for tuning in for this episode. Until we see you next time, bye-bye.